There is something happening at World Cup 2026 that the cameras are only catching in fragments, and if you are only watching the goals, the highlights, and the polished tournament promos, you are missing the real story, because beneath the noise of packed stadiums, giant sponsorships, and FIFA's promises of the biggest and most inclusive World Cup ever, a different narrative is starting to take shape, one built not just on football, but on frustration, exhaustion, defiance, and resistance. And that is why this tournament already feels different from any World Cup that came before it, because this time it is not just one player, one coach, or one controversy making headlines. It is a pattern, a growing pattern involving 10 different teams who, in very different ways, look like they are pushing back against the system FIFA has created. And the first signal comes from Brazil, where the mood around the squad feels bigger than results alone, because when one of the biggest football nations in the world starts showing signs that its stars are no longer willing to play every commercial role expected of them, you begin to understand that this tournament is not only testing talent, it is testing patience. And Brazil's presence in this story matters because when global superstars start setting limits, even small acts begin to look like open rebellion. Then there is Spain, a team that came into this competition carrying the aura of control, pedigree, and technical superiority. The kind of team everyone assumes will glide through the early stage of the tournament with style and authority. But when a giant like Spain suddenly looks uncomfortable, flat, and vulnerable under conditions that are supposed to elevate the game, the question is no longer just whether they had a bad day. The question becomes whether this expanded format, this sprawling tournament across multiple countries, cities, climates, and travel schedules, is quietly draining even the strongest football powers in ways that no one wants to admit. And that brings us to Cape Verde, one of the clearest symbols of why this World Cup feels like a pressure point rather than a celebration. Because when a smaller nation with far fewer resources walks onto the same field as one of Europe's elite and refuses to play the role of the frightened outsider, when they defend with courage, absorb pressure, disrupt rhythm, and make a football giant look ordinary, that is no longer just an underdog story, that is a direct challenge to the hierarchy FIFA sells to the world. A reminder that the structure may be global, but the script is no longer under control. Then comes Iran, whose presence in the tournament feels like resistance in its purest form, because when a team has to deal with travel complications, political barriers, access restrictions, missing officials, disrupted preparation, and uncertainty around logistics while still trying to compete at the highest level, every minute they survive on the pitch becomes more than competition. It becomes a statement, and that statement is simple. If FIFA wants to present this World Cup as the ultimate symbol of football unity, then why are some teams clearly experiencing a completely different reality than others? Morocco belongs in this conversation too, because they represent the modern team that has the quality, energy, and belief to trouble anyone. But they also expose how much this tournament is asking from players physically, mentally, and emotionally, especially in conditions where heat, recovery, scheduling, and constant movement are impossible to ignore. And when teams like Morocco, built on intensity and sharp transitions, start looking like they are fighting more than just their opponents, you start to see the deeper tension between player welfare and tournament spectacle. Qatar may not be the first team people mention when talking about resistance, but their role in this unfolding story is important because they symbolize what happens when smaller football nations are invited onto the biggest stage and expected to be grateful just for being included. Yet instead of quietly accepting that role, they compete, frustrate, survive, and challenge expectations. And every point they win, every organized defensive display, every moment of discipline becomes a rejection of the idea that some teams are only there to decorate the tournament. Scotland's place in this story is emotional but no less powerful, because teams like Scotland carry history, hunger, and long memories. And when they finally begin to break old patterns, when they turn pain into momentum, it feels like more than football. It feels like a collision between tradition and a modern tournament structure that often seems too commercial, too heavy, and too mechanical to understand what these moments really mean to the players and supporters living them. Belgium enters the picture from another angle, because for teams carrying massive expectations, the revolt is sometimes quieter. It shows up in body language, tension, awkward performances, and the strange feeling that top-level talent is being forced through a tournament system that offers no room to breathe. And when one of the most gifted squads in world football starts looking more burdened than liberated, it raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe this World Cup is not designed to bring out the best football. Maybe it is designed to survive its own scale. Egypt's story matters because they represent the kind of nation that arrives carrying the weight of millions, the pressure of identity, and the hope of proving they belong at the top level. But when preparation is compressed, travel is relentless, and the environmental and structural demands keep stacking up. That journey stops being just about tactics and quality. It becomes about endurance, and there is something quietly rebellious about a team continuing to fight when the tournament seems to be asking more from them than from others. And then there is New Zealand, a team many people would overlook in the wider World Cup conversation. But that is exactly why they belong in this list. Because teams like New Zealand expose whether expansion was really about football opportunity or simply about making the event bigger, louder, and more profitable. And when so-called smaller teams step onto the pitch with organization, belief, and fearlessness, they force everyone to confront the same question. If these nations are ready for the stage, why does the stage itself feel so unstable? And when you put all 10 of these teams together, Brazil, Spain, Cape Verde, Iran, Morocco, Qatar, Scotland, Belgium, Egypt, and New Zealand, what you get is not 10 isolated stories. You get 10 warning signs, 10 different forms of friction, 10 reminders that this World Cup is carrying a tension its own branding cannot hide. Because some teams are resisting publicly, some are resisting through performance, some through survival, some through mentality, and some simply by refusing to collapse under conditions that seem designed without them fully in mind. And that is what makes World Cup 2026 feel so strange. The football is still there, the drama is still there, the shocks, the stars, the emotion, the moments of magic, all of that still exists. But running underneath it is a much darker and more dangerous question. What happens when the biggest tournament in the world becomes so large, so commercial, so demanding, and so carefully packaged that the people inside it, the players, the teams, the federations, begin pushing back in ways the organizers can no longer fully control? Because maybe this is not just the story of a few difficult opening days. Maybe this is the beginning of something much bigger. Maybe this is the first World Cup where the real battle is not only for the trophy, but against the system surrounding it. And if that is true, then FIFA may have created the biggest World Cup in history, only to discover that bigger does not always mean better, and that the more pressure you build into the tournament, the more likely it is that eventually the teams inside it stop playing along.